Hi, I'm Mike Richmond, publisher of Quality Digest. I'm joined today by Jeff Eves, Green Services Program Manager, Business Assurance of Intertek. Jeff, thanks for joining us today to chat about the upcoming 2015 version of ISO 14001.
Thanks a lot for having me in.
It's our pleasure. Well, let's jump right into it by asking you about the core objectives of ISO 14001, the Environmental Management System Standard.
Okay. Really, the overall aim of the standard continues to be to provide a systematic framework to protect the environment and in balance with socio-economic means. So basically what ISO is saying here is, what they want to do is add to the sustainability aspect of the standard, where perhaps before it was more concentrating on identifying aspects and making sure you're managing these aspects and complying. Now I think they're really trying to create a more forward-looking standard in which they're asking the organization to identify the value stream potential environmental impacts, as well as product or downstream related aspects, and manage those so they can be more sustainable. And as you know, a lot of companies are subscribing to the triple bottom line, which is essentially not only thinking of financial aspects to managing their business, but also the social and then, of course, environmental. And I think the revisions to the standard go a long way to help promote that. And so the other revisions, they're talking about revising the standard to try to formalize ISO's clauses in terms of making it more integratable with the other standards. For instance, ISO 9001 or you've got OSAS 18001. So they're kind of reorganizing what the clauses state and how they state it, but in order to kind of strengthen how they can link within managing the business, as well as, again, integrating much more seamlessly the different standards together, so people can have a much easier way to implement these integrated management systems.
Got it. Now, the 2015 revision of ISO 14001, as I understand, contains 11 analyzed themes. That's a lot. So what are they, and what is the significance of each one of them?
Well, I'll cover some of them just in the interest of time, but as I mentioned before, sustainable development is a theme that they really wanted to emphasize in this. And so anyone reading the draft standard can see that they're asking organizations to consider a life cycle approach. And again, what type of environmental aspects and impacts related to raw materials, the products, end of life as far as disposal, and what impacts their product has on the environment. And that's a pretty interesting change as well. And environmental performance improvement is another concentration where they really want to help clarify and define how a company is going to identify environmental improvements and monitor these. And so the standard is improved with respect to that. Legal requirements, again, that's one of the key components of ISO 14001. And one of the expected outcomes of a certified organization is that they have a good process in place to identify the legal requirements that apply to them, and of course implement those within the system so that they're hopefully always complying. And not every company is 100% in compliance at all times, but certainly that's the goal, and will certainly improve as a company implements an effective environmental management system. One of the other ones was strategic business management. And as I said, the standard's been reorganized in accordance with ISO's Guide 83. And again, it's going to be very similar to ISO 9001 when that comes out. And they're going to be speaking the same language, and hopefully you'll be able to link the ISO components with the business administration a little bit stronger with the new revision. Conformity assessment, in terms of how you look at conformity to the standard as well as your system. And a couple of the other things are related to national or, for instance, international policy agendas, which I guess could be restated as interested parties. One interesting addition or reorganization is talking about context of the organization. Companies actually have to think of what interested parties expect out of them, and internal and external context, and implications related to their operations. And so they've got to consider all these when they implement their system. And so that really it's the organization has to think a little bit more about how they're interacting with the environment when it comes to the new standard. And the working group has worked pretty hard at trying to make things a little bit more clear and hopefully help out the small and medium enterprise organizations looking at the standard thinking maybe it's too much, but they're trying to make it, in fact, easier for companies to understand and implement.
Now, Jeff, the current version of ISO 14001 is from 2004, and that's 11 years between the versions. That's a long time in the standards world. So what are the key differences between the current version and the new one that we can look forward to?
Okay. Yeah, it has been a long time, you're right. And I think what's come out of it again is the implementation of sustainability and the reorganization. And just let me elaborate a little bit on that. So presently 14,001, you have one section that Clause 4 from 4.1 through 4.6. Now it's basically going to be broken up into 10 sections, and just briefly covering them. You've got the scope, normative references, terms and conditions, the context of the organization. That's a whole clause in and of itself. Leadership, planning, support, operation, performance evaluation, and improvement. So basically, all the existing ISO 14,000 requirements are put into these other subtopics and reworded. And again, they'll align more closely with 9001, but it's really a new way of looking at some of these clauses. Some of the key changes for these, again, with respect to the context of the organization, that's where the company has to define the scope. And one very interesting thing about that is right now, a lot of organizations define the scope as kind of a fence line audit. So they're identifying all the aspects and controlling the aspects related to their facility only. But again, because now they have to think in a life cycle approach, now they have to consider, their aspects related to their products and raw materials, vendors, things like that. So these things are kind of outside the fence line, and they're going to have to really think about that. And the new standard, the new draft standard, is actually saying if these activities or products or services have a potential for a significant impact on the environment, they cannot exclude these things from the scope. So now, for instance, a company can exclude aspects related to products they're manufacturing, but if they have significant aspects from those products, they can no longer exclude them. So again, I think an interesting addition here is we're going to see potentially a fair amount of scope expansion, again, depending on how many aspects that these arise. With respect to leadership, more emphasis on management responsibility, mitigating risks, especially sustainable resources use. They want companies to think about climate change, biodiversity, habitat issues. So again, getting beyond what's happening strictly on their own facility. Planning with respect to their aspects, as I mentioned, not only identifying these new ones potentially, but also determining key performance indicators for their objectives. That's something I think it's a great change. Right now, a lot of organizations identify their objectives, but they struggle with finding good key performance indicators to tell them if they are really improving or not. And so the standard is a little bit more clear and hopefully it'll help organizations do a better job identifying these KPIs. And then there's some other additions in terms of support, expanding the communication strategy and external reporting procedure. Right now it's pretty limited, and there's a lot more with respect to reporting and communication that the standard talks about as opposed to the previous edition. And then on the last one, on improvement, new section on continual improvement with respect to environmental performance. I think that's going to be a key thing, as I said, especially with respect to objectives, but then also identifying the key operations or key characteristics within the organization and how to monitor those and use that data so that they can properly assess it and identify opportunities for improvement.
Well, a lot of changes, certainly, I think, between these two versions of the standard. So a little two-part question here for you. What are these changes going to mean for those considering registration to ISO 14001 for the first time? And secondly, how's it going to affect those that are already registered to the standard?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think for the companies that are not registered yet, they're going to be taking a look at potentially maybe a bigger hill to overcome. And although I know with the anticipated changes with respect to clarity and on what some of these clauses mean and what implementation entails, I think that's going to be very helpful. But again, for most companies adopting the new criteria, it really shouldn't pose any significant problems. But it will require a fair amount of time reviewing the standard and potentially making changes to their documentation. Again, if there's more significant raw material or product related aspects, that might mean a greater addition to the scope and things like operational controls, legal requirements related to these that maybe they didn't have before that they've got to consider now. And again, the life cycle approach. Right now, the standard's basically saying it doesn't have to be a comprehensive review, but they do have to consider that. And we'll have to, I guess, wait and see what the final version says. But really what the intent here is that companies can take a look at the potential life cycle approach and make sure that they adequately are addressing these. And again, it doesn't necessarily have to mean significant change. I will say that a lot of companies have what we would call a clause-based manual. In other words, they've got a manual that reflects the clauses of the standard. Well, that's being significantly revised. And so companies, not that they really have to, but they may decide to rewrite or reorganize their manual to fit with the new clauses of the standard. And whether they do that or some kind of a cross-reference, that might be a good thing for them to do. One thing that's is interesting as well is in our auditing, we do tend to see a disconnect between sustainability programs that a company has, and you might see these outlined in their annual report that they publish. A lot of times these sustainability initiatives are not really managed within the confines of the EMS. And I think organizations are going to have to take a look at that, or may actually have to integrate these initiatives in order to demonstrate conformance to the new standard. And so it's something, when we do see that disconnect, we do encourage our clients to consider managing those. And I think, again, because of the sustainable development addition to the new standard, people are really going to be hopefully taking advantage of that and integrating that within their system.
So, Jeff, in the short to midterm, what can we expect to see in the coming months with regard to the revision? What is the technical committee going to be looking at and issuing as we end 2014 and go into 2015?
Sure. The final draft is expected out this fall, hopefully in September is the last I've heard. And then a final version of the standard is expected mid-2015. So what that means basically is when the new standard is issued, the accreditation bodies will have to determine a transition period for the organizations to upgrade to the new standard. And they basically provide that requirement to certification bodies like Intertek. And so we have to put a plan in place and communicate with our clients and say, okay, this is the time period you have, and you'll need to upgrade to it, and we can upgrade the clients potentially along with their current certification cycle, or potentially we may have to do specific audits to check and do the gap analysis to make sure that they've upgraded to the new standard. And the last revision from 96 to 2004, there was an 18-month window provided for that. And given the extent of changes, I would anticipate to see at least that, possibly even more. So companies will have some time to not only look at, but then also work on upgrading to the new standard.
Well, at this stage in the game, what would you recommend? And you see a lot of these companies, of course. You audit a lot of these companies in this space. What can, in your opinion, companies do at this point to begin preparing for the new version of the standard?
Yeah, I think companies really need to do something for sure as soon as possible. And I would certainly recommend that they purchase the final draft standard when that is available. And from what we've seen historically, that there's not a lot of change from the final draft standard to the final version when it's published. And start taking a look at that. A lot of companies like CBs and consultants are starting to issue webinars, training, and blogs on the changes. So I would definitely recommend companies to connect with these different resources and start taking a look at what the requirements are, but perhaps, again, attend some training. Also, begin taking a look at that, the life cycle approach, understanding, I guess, more the inputs and outputs of their environmental system. And because, again, there might be a fair amount of change with respect to the scope of their system as needed. So some organization that there'll be very little change, others there could be substantial changes. So if they start looking at what potential changes they could have with respect to that life cycle approach, that would be time well spent. And with respect to that, again, start doing a cross-reference look at the new standard clauses versus what they put in place to meet the current standard, and see what needs to be made from a documentation standpoint. Do that gap analysis and start working on the changes so hopefully when the time comes to upgrade, they won't be one of the last companies in line trying to get everything done at the last minute. So as long as people, again, continue to monitor the ISO news and look for communications from their certification bodies like us on the important time frames and developments, they should be in good shape.
Good advice. Well, thanks, Jeff. We've again been joined by Jeff Eves, Green Services Program Manager, Business Assurance of Intertek. Jeff, again, thank you very much for joining us to begin to look forward to the 2015 version of ISO 14001.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Great. We'll talk to you soon.